The bullet whispered past Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen's ear at 0347 hours, close enough that he could smell the cordite and feel the heat signature against his neck. In the pre-dawn darkness of Kandahar province, that should have been his death sentence. Instead, it was his salvation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 300 meters away, concealed in a bombed-out school building that intelligence had marked as abandoned, Harper Moore adjusted her breathing and chambered another round. Through her scope, she watched Chen dive behind the concrete barrier, his radio crackling with panicked voices reporting contact from an unknown position. She had maybe 30 seconds before his squad would triangulate her muzzle flash. From the previous shot that had taken down the insurgent sniper who'd had Chen lined up in his crosshairs, the irony wasn't lost on her. She'd saved a man who didn't know she existed from an enemy who'd never seen her coming, while wearing a face that nobody in this theater of operations had ever truly looked at. The school around her bore the scars of war like ritual markings. Bullet holes peppered the walls in constellations that told stories of firefights and last stands. Children's drawings still clung to one wall, faded and torn, but somehow defiant. She'd chosen this position not just for its tactical advantage, elevated, multiple escape routes, clear sight lines, but because something about the lingering innocence in those crayon marks reminded her why she was here, why she kept pulling triggers from shadows, saving lives that would never know her name. Chen's voice cut through the radio chatter, calm and professional despite having a death brush past his ear moments before. Overwatch, we have friendly fire. From an unknown position. Grid 41, SMD1, 2345678. Request immediate identification of the shooter. Harper smiled grimly as she gathered her equipment. Friendly fire. If only he knew how friendly. She'd been tracking his patrol for 3 days, ever since intelligence indicated that insurgents had infiltrated the local police force and were feeding information about American movements to Taliban operatives. Chen's squad had been walking into ambush after ambush, and somehow, impossibly, they kept walking out alive. They walked out alive because Harper Moore was rewriting their fate. One bullet at a time. Her rifle, a customized M40A6 that she'd modified, beyond all recognition, slid into its case with practiced efficiency. The weapon was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat, and like her heart, it carried secrets that could destroy everything if exposed. The serial numbers had been filed away and replaced with false ones. The ballistic signature had been altered through careful barrel modifications. Even the ammunition was hand-loaded with her own specifications, designed to leave forensic investigators chasing shadows. She slipped through the school's back exit, navigating rubble and debris with the silent precision that had kept her alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. Behind her, she could hear helicopters approaching. Chen's squad calling in support, medevac, and probably a full investigation team. They'd find evidence of the insurgent sniper she'd eliminated, a man who'd been responsible for 7 American deaths in the past month. They'd find his rifle, his ammunition, and his plans for future attacks. What they wouldn't find was any trace of the woman who'd saved their lives. The safe house was a 40-minute walk through terrain that would challenge even experienced soldiers. For Harper, it might as well have been a stroll through a park. She knew every stone, every shadow, every hiding place within a 10-kilometer radius. This knowledge had been earned through countless nights of reconnaissance, of mapping routes and memorizing landmarks by starlight. It was the kind of preparation that separated the living from the dead in a war zone, and Harper Moore intended to keep living, even if nobody knew she was alive. The safe house itself was unremarkable, a mud brick structure that looked like 1,000 others scattered across the Afghan countryside. Inside, though, it was a masterpiece of concealment and functionality. The walls were lined with sound-dampening materials disguised as traditional rugs. The floor had been reinforced to handle the weight of her equipment. Most importantly, the cellar had been excavated and fortified, creating a space where she could maintain and modify her weapons without detection. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos was waiting when Harper arrived, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and concern that had become as familiar as breathing over the past year. Maria was Harper's spotter, communications specialist, and the only person in the entire theater who knew the full scope of their mission. She was also the closest thing to family that Harper had left in the world. Chun's squad made it back to base, Maria reported as Harper began breaking down her rifle for cleaning. No casualties, thanks to you. But there's chatter about the investigation. They're calling it the Guardian Angel incident, apparently. It's the 7th time in 3 weeks that squad has survived an ambush against impossible odds. Harper's hands never paused in their methodical work, but Maria caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Let them investigate, Harper said quietly. They'll find dead insurgents and grateful soldiers. Nothing more. What if they start looking deeper? What if someone connects the dots? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Harper set down her cleaning rod and looked directly at Maria, her green eyes carrying the weight of decisions that most people would never have to make. Then we disappear, again. The word again carried 17 years of history, 3 false identities, and a trail of official documents that led nowhere. Harper Moore was not the name on her birth certificate, just as Maria Santos was not the name that her mother had whispered in Spanish lullabies. They were ghosts who had chosen to become guardians, and ghosts, by definition, left no traces. But even ghosts had origins, and Harper's began in a small town in Montana where a girl named Sarah Henderson had learned to shoot by hunting deer with her grandfather. That girl had joined the army to escape a life that felt too small, had excelled beyond all expectations, and had caught the attention of people who recruited soldiers for wars that didn't officially exist. Sarah Henderson had died in a helicopter crash in 2007, according to military records. Harper Moore had been born from her ashes, and Harper Moore had been dying slowly ever since. There's something else, Maria said, her voice careful and measured. Lieutenant Colonel Chen has been asking questions. Not about us specifically, but about ... anomalies. Unexplained successes. He's smart, Harper. Maybe too smart. Through the small window of the safe house, Harper could see the first hints of dawn painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, Chun was probably writing his after-action report, trying to explain how his squad had survived. Another impossible situation. He would note the timing, the precision, the fact that their mysterious guardian had struck at exactly the right moment to save American lives while eliminating a high-value target. What he wouldn't write, because he couldn't know, was that Harper Moore had been watching his squad for weeks. That she'd studied their patrol patterns, their communication protocols, their individual personalities and fears. That she knew Chun took exactly 14 seconds longer than regulation when checking corners because he'd lost 3 men to IEDs, and now approached every potential danger with the careful patience of someone who'd learned that haste killed soldiers. That he carried a picture of his daughter in his left breast pocket and touched it unconsciously before every mission briefing. She'd studied Chun's patterns to keep him alive. Chun was going to survive this war, return home to his daughter, and eventually become a general who would reshape how America trained and deployed its special operations forces. His influence would save thousands of lives over the coming decades, but only if he lived long enough to wield that influence. That was the weight Harper carried with every shot she fired. Not just the immediate tactical decision of who lived and who died in the moment, but the long-term strategic implications of how those decisions would ripple outward through time. She was playing chess with history itself, and the stakes were measured in generations. Chun's questions don't concern me, Harper said finally, though they both knew that was only partially true. What concerns me is the pattern. 7 incidents. In 3 weeks. Even the best luck has limits, and people are starting to notice that Chen's squad has very good luck. Maria nodded, understanding the implication immediately. In the intelligence community, patterns were signatures, and signatures led to exposure. They needed to be more careful, more subtle, or they needed to change their operational parameters entirely. The radio crackled with morning reports, casualty updates, mission briefings, the daily rhythm of a war that had been grinding on for so long that most people had forgotten why it started. Harper listened with half her attention while completing the ritual cleaning of her rifle. Each component was inspected, cleaned, and reassembled with the kind of methodical precision that meditation masters spent decades trying to achieve. The rifle was not just a tool. It was an extension of her will, and her will was focused on a singular purpose: keeping good people alive in a world that seemed determined to kill them. But as she worked, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Chun's questions were just the beginning. The pattern recognition that made him a good officer would eventually lead him to conclusions that could destroy everything she'd spent years building. And there were other complications on the horizon: new intelligence, indicating that insurgent forces were adapting to the presence of an unknown sniper, changing their tactics in ways that made Harper's protection missions exponentially more dangerous. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the Afghan landscape that would soon become shimmering heat mirages. In a few hours, Chun's squad would head out on another patrol, following routes that had been analyzed and approved by intelligence officers who thought they understood the tactical situation. They didn't know that their intelligence was being supplemented by a woman who moved through the darkness like a force of nature, reshaping outcomes through precisely applied violence. Harper Moore was a legend that didn't know it was legendary, a ghost story being told around campfires and forward operating bases across Afghanistan. Soldiers would talk about impossible saves, miraculous interventions, the sense that someone was watching over them in the most dangerous places. They didn't know her name, couldn't describe her face, had never heard her voice. But they knew she existed, and that knowledge was both Harper's greatest achievement and her most dangerous liability. As Maria began preparing their daily intelligence briefing, Harper found herself staring at the children's drawings she'd salvaged from the school wall. Faded crayon marks depicting families, houses, and dreams of peace that existed somewhere beyond the reach of bullets and bombs. Those drawings reminded her why precision mattered, why every shot had to count, why the mission was worth the price she paid for it every single day. But they also reminded her of something she tried not to think about too often: the fact that she was fighting a war that might never end, protecting people who would never know her name, slowly erasing herself in service to a cause that demanded everything and offered nothing in return. The question that haunted her, the one she never spoke aloud even to Maria, was simple and devastating. How long could a ghost remain human? And what happened when the answer was not much longer? Harper's days began at 0430 hours, not because of military discipline, but because sleep had become a negotiation with nightmares that always ended in compromise. She would lie in the narrow cot of the safe house, listening to Maria's steady breathing from across the room, and catalog the sounds of a world waking up around her. The call to prayer from the village mosque, the distant rumble of military vehicles beginning their morning patrols, the whisper of wind across mountain peaks that had witnessed centuries of conflict and would witness centuries more. Her morning routine was a ritual of transformation. First, the physical preparation exercises that maintained the strength and flexibility required for precision shooting. Push-ups, planks, and yoga positions that stretched muscles conditioned by hours of remaining motionless in shooting positions. Then came the mental preparation meditation techniques learned from a Tibetan monk in Dharamshala during a leave that officially never happened. breathing exercises that could slow her heart rate to 40 beats per minute, visualization practices that let her mentally rehearse shots before she ever touched her rifle. But the most important part of her morning routine was the mirror. Harper would stand before a small piece of reflective glass, studying the face that looked back at her, and practice forgetting who she used to be. Sarah Henderson had been 5'7" with strawberry blonde hair and freckles that marked her as irrevocably Midwestern. Harper Moore was 5'6" with dark brown hair and brown eyes, courtesy of contact lenses and careful makeup techniques. Learned from a CIA operative who specialized in identity manipulation. The change was subtle but complete: different posture, different vocal patterns, different ways of moving through space. The transformation went deeper than cosmetics, though. Sarah Henderson had been optimistic, trusting, quick to laugh, and slow to anger. Harper Moore was careful, analytical, and carried a sadness that felt older than her 28 years. Some mornings, Harper would catch glimpses of Sarah in the mirror, a particular tilt of her head, or a moment when her natural smile broke through her carefully constructed facade, and she would have to look away before the recognition became too painful to bear. "You're doing it again," Maria would observe on mornings when the transformation took longer than usual. "Fighting yourself in the mirror." "Just making sure the mask fits properly," Harper would reply, but they both knew it was more complicated than that. The mask wasn't something she put on. It was something she had become. And some days it felt like it was becoming more real than the person underneath. Her relationship with Maria was the one constant in a life built on variables and contingencies. They had been paired together 3 years ago, when Harper was still learning to navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth of deep black operations, and Maria was recovering from a mission in Central America that had left her with perfect Spanish, chronic insomnia, and a profound distrust of official channels. They had recognized something in each other, a commitment to the mission that transcended personal ambition, and a willingness to pay prices that most people couldn't even imagine. Maria handled communications, logistics, and intelligence analysis with a precision that bordered on artistry. She could decrypt enemy communications, forge documents that would fool forensic analysis, and navigate the complex web of relationships that kept their operations supplied and concealed. But more than that, she served as Harper's anchor to humanity, the person who remembered her jokes, called her on her bullshit, and refused to let her disappear entirely into the role she'd been asked to play. Their conversations revealed the careful balance they maintained between professional necessity and personal connection. Intel came in this morning about a new high-value target. Maria reported over breakfast. Military MRE supplemented with local bread and tea that is sympathetic. Shopkeeper provided in exchange for medical supplies they occasionally left behind. Someone's been coordinating the attacks on supply convoys. 3 successful ambushes in the past 2 weeks, American casualties mounting. Harper listened while cleaning her sidearm, a modified Glock 19 that she hoped never to use, but carried everywhere. Location? That's the problem. He's mobile, never stays in one place for more than 24 hours. But there's a pattern in his movements. He's always positioned within striking distance of Chen's patrol routes. The mention of Chen's name brought Harper's attention into sharp focus. Over the past month, she developed what could only be described as a professional obsession with keeping Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen alive. It had started as a simple protective assignment. Chen was a valuable asset who possessed intelligence that could compromise ongoing operations if captured. But it had evolved into something more personal, more complex. Harper had spent so many hours studying Chen through her scope that she'd begun to feel like she knew him. She knew that he favored his right side when moving through doorways, a habit developed after taking shrapnel to his left shoulder during his first deployment. She knew that he always checked his equipment twice before leaving base, not because he didn't trust his soldiers, but because he'd learned that attention to detail Was the difference between coming home and coming home in a box? She knew that. He wrote letters to his daughter every evening, even when there was no way to send them, because the act of writing kept him connected to the life he was fighting to preserve. What disturbed Harper was that she'd started to care about Chun's survival, for reasons that had nothing to do with the mission parameters. She'd begun to think of him not as an asset to be protected, but as a person whose life had value independent of his strategic importance. That kind of emotional investment was dangerous in her line of work, but she couldn't seem to stop herself from developing it. "I need to see the intelligence file," Harper said, holstering her weapon and reaching for the tablet where Maria stored encrypted communications. The file painted a picture of a methodical and intelligent enemy. The high-value target designated. HVT-7 in their operational communications had orchestrated attacks that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of American patrol patterns, communication protocols, and tactical preferences. He wasn't just lucky. He was informed. And his information was getting American soldiers killed. But there was something else in the intelligence that caught Harper's attention. HVT-7's movements weren't random, despite what the official analysis suggested. There was indeed a pattern, but it wasn't focused on supply convoys or high-value targets. It was focused on Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen. "Maria," Harper said quietly, "this isn't about the convoys. This is personal." Maria leaned over to study the data Harper was highlighting on the tablet. "You think he's specifically targeting Chun?" "I think someone wants Chun dead, and they've hired HVT-7 to make it happen. The convoy attacks are misdirection collateral damage designed to mask the real objective." The implications settled over them like dust from a distant explosion. If Harper was right, then Chun wasn't just an asset to be protected. He was the primary target of an assassination plot that had already killed dozens of American soldiers. And Harper was the only person in a position to stop it. But stopping it would require her to break the first rule of covert operations: maintain deniability at all costs. She would have to risk exposure, risk capture, risk the destruction of everything she'd built over the past 3 years. She would have to choose between the mission and the man, between strategic objectives and personal conscience. "There's something else," Maria said, her voice carrying a weight that Harper had learned to recognize as the precursor to very bad news. "I've been monitoring communications between our handlers and higher command. There's talk about reassigning our operational parameters." Harper looked up from the tablet, her attention fully engaged. Reassignment in their world usually meant one of two things: promotion to even more dangerous work, or termination of the program entirely. Given the recent attention surrounding Chun's miraculous survival rate, Harper suspected it wasn't the former. "What kind of reassignment?" "The kind where we disappear completely. New identities, new theater of operations, new mission parameters. Maybe Africa, maybe Eastern Europe. Somewhere they need ghosts who know how to kill people without leaving fingerprints." The prospect should have brought relief. Harper had been Harper Moore for 3 years, longer than she'd maintained any single identity since the program began. She was tired of the weight of secrecy, tired of the careful balance between human connection and operational security, tired of killing people to save people in a war that seemed to have no clear definition of victory. But the thought of abandoning Chun to face HVT-7 alone filled her with a dread that surprised her with its intensity. Over the months of protecting him, she'd begun to invest emotionally in the outcome of his survival. Chun represented something that Harper had almost forgotten existed: the possibility that good people could survive impossible circumstances and go on to make the world incrementally better through their continued existence. "How long do we have?" Harper asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Long enough to finish current operations and prepare for extraction. Harper nodded, but her mind was already working through contingencies and possibilities. 2 weeks to neutralize HVT-7. ensure Chun's continued survival, and find a way to transition her protective oversight to someone else, or to some system that could continue the work she'd been doing without requiring her physical presence. Afternoon brought surveillance work, the patient and methodical process of gathering intelligence that would inform evening operations. Harper positioned herself in a different location each day, always within overwatch distance of American positions, but never in the same place twice. Today's hide was an abandoned watchtower that provided excellent visibility of the main routes. Into and out of the forward operating base where Chun's unit was stationed. Through her spotting scope, she observed the routine activities of soldiers preparing for another patrol. She watched Chun brief his squad leaders, noting the way he listened to their concerns and incorporated their suggestions into the operational plan. She watched him check equipment, review maps, and conduct the 100 small tasks that officers perform to keep their soldiers alive in hostile territory. But she also watched for signs of the enemy surveillance that she knew had to be present. HVT-7 was too successful, too well-informed, to be operating without eyes on his targets. Someone was watching Chun's unit, gathering intelligence, reporting movements and patterns back to the people who wanted Chin dead. It took 3 hours of patient observation before Harper spotted him, a man in civilian clothes who appeared to be repairing a motorcycle by the side of the road, but who never actually touched any tools. His position gave him clear sight lines to the base entrance, and Harper noticed that he was equipped with a small radio and what appeared to be a compact camera with a telephoto lens. The discovery brought both satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction, because it confirmed Harper's theory about targeted surveillance. Concern, because it meant HVT-7's network was larger and more sophisticated than intelligence estimates had suggested. The man with the motorcycle was professional, patient, and nearly invisible, exactly the kind of operative who could gather intelligence for months without detection. Harper spent the rest of the afternoon developing a plan to neutralize the surveillance operative without compromising her own position. It would require careful timing, precise movement, and the kind of close-quarters work that she'd trained for but hoped never to use. Killing from distance was clinical, almost mathematical. Killing up close was personal, messy, and left the kind of psychological residue that accumulated over time like radiation exposure. As evening approached and Chun's patrol prepared to depart, Harper made her decision. She would eliminate the surveillance operative first, then position herself to intercept whatever action HVT-7 had planned for Chun's squad. It was a complex operation that required perfect timing and flawless execution, but Harper had built her reputation on achieving both. The last light of day was fading when Harper began her approach to the motorcycle surveillance position. She moved through terrain that offered concealment while maintaining sight lines to both the operative and Chun's departing patrol. The distance was 200 meters, close enough to ensure accurate placement of her shots, far enough to maintain plausible deniability if anyone investigated the incident. But as she settled into her shooting position, Harper realized that she was crossing a line she'd never crossed before. Until tonight, her work had been purely defensive, protecting American assets from enemy action, eliminating threats that had already declared their hostile intent. Tonight, she was going to kill a man who hadn't yet committed a crime, based on intelligence analysis and operational assumptions that might be wrong. The weight of that decision settled over her like a familiar cloak. This was what it meant to be Harper Moore, to make choices that other people couldn't make, to accept responsibility for outcomes that couldn't be undone, to carry the moral weight of actions that would never be acknowledged or officially sanctioned. Harper Moore was a woman who saved lives by taking them, and tonight she was about to do both. The surveillance operative died at 1947 hours, without ever knowing that Harper Moore existed. One moment he was adjusting his radio frequency while maintaining visual contact with the base entrance. The next moment, he was unconscious on the ground with a .308 caliber hole through his brainstem. Harper's shot had been precise, clean, and utterly silent thanks to the suppressor that added 18 inches to her rifle's length but reduced the acoustic signature to barely more than a cough. But killing the spotter was only the beginning of the evening's work. Harper repositioned immediately, using a route she'd practiced a dozen times during reconnaissance missions that had prepared her for exactly this scenario. The abandoned textile factory that became her new hide offered multiple firing positions, excellent concealment, and 3 separate escape routes that would allow her to disappear into the Afghan night if the situation deteriorated beyond her ability to control it. Through her scope, she tracked Chun's patrol as they moved along their assigned route, a winding path through the village that intelligence had designated as moderate risk, but which Harper's analysis suggested was about to become a killing field. The timing was too convenient, the surveillance too professional, the entire situation too carefully orchestrated to be anything other than an elaborate trap. Chun's squad consisted of 12 soldiers, each of whom Harper had studied extensively over the past months. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the squad's medic, who carried pictures of his twin sons and always volunteered for the most dangerous assignments because he believed his medical training gave him the best chance of keeping everyone alive. Specialist Thompson, barely 19 years old and so homesick that he talked about his girlfriend's cooking every single day, but who had demonstrated extraordinary courage during their last contact with enemy forces. Corporal Jackson, a former gang member from Detroit, who joined the Army to escape a life that was already killing him, and who discovered that he had a natural talent for tactical leadership and an unshakable commitment to protecting his brothers. Arms. Harper knew all of their names, their personal histories, their individual strengths and weaknesses. She knew them because keeping them alive required understanding them as complete human beings rather than interchangeable military assets. And tonight, that knowledge was about to be put to the ultimate test. The ambush came at 20:23 hours, 37 minutes later than Harper had calculated, but precisely when her tactical analysis had identified as the optimal engagement window. The initial contact was a rocket-propelled grenade that destroyed the lead vehicle in Chen's convoy, followed immediately by coordinated small arms fire from 3 separate positions. It was a textbook L-shaped ambush, perfectly executed by insurgents, who had clearly studied American convoy tactics and developed specific countermeasures. But what the insurgents hadn't accounted for was Harper Moore. Her first shot eliminated the RPG gunner before he could reload. Her second shot took out the machine gunner who was suppressing Chun's squad from an elevated position in a bombed-out building. Her third shot removed the tactical commander who was coordinating the ambush from a concealed position behind a concrete wall that should have provided perfect protection from ground-level return fire. Each shot was a work of art in applied physics and practiced precision. Harper had to account for wind speed, air density, target movement, and the ballistic properties of ammunition that she had hand-loaded to specifications that existed nowhere in any military manual. More importantly, she had to make each shot count, because every second of delay increased the probability that one of Chun's soldiers would die before she could intervene, the insurgents' reaction to their leadership being systematically eliminated by an invisible sniper was predictable but tactically sound. They began suppressing the area where they thought Harper's shots were originating, filling the air with automatic weapons fire that would have been devastating if Harper had been anywhere near their target zone. Instead, she was already repositioning to her secondary firing position, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who had practiced this exact scenario hundreds of times in training exercises that officially never happened. From her new position, Harper could see the tactical situation developing in real time. Chun's squad had taken cover behind their disabled vehicles and were returning fire with professional competence, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The insurgents had positioned themselves with excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes, suggesting a level of tactical sophistication that exceeded typical Taliban capabilities. This wasn't a random attack. It was a carefully planned military operation designed to eliminate specific targets. Harper's fourth shot killed an insurgent sniper who was attempting to flank Chen's position. Her fifth shot eliminated a fighter who was preparing to throw grenades into the Americans' defensive position. Her sixth shot took out the communications specialist who was calling for reinforcements that would have turned the engagement from a manageable skirmish into a full-scale battle. But even as Harper systematically dismantled the ambush, she realized that something fundamental had changed in the tactical calculus. The insurgents weren't retreating despite losing their leadership and suffering casualties that should have broken their morale. Instead, they were adapting, adjusting their tactics to account for the presence of an unknown sniper, and continuing to press their attack with a determination that suggested they were willing to accept significant casualties to achieve their objectives. This wasn't just about killing American soldiers. This was about killing Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen specifically, and the people behind this operation were prepared to sacrifice an entire insurgent cell to make it happen. Harper's radio crackled with communications from Chen's squad as they called for medical evacuation, air support, and backup from nearby units. The voices were calm and professional, but Harper could hear the underlying tension that came from soldiers who knew they were fighting for their lives against opponents who were better prepared and more numerous than intelligence estimates had suggested. Overwatch, this is 6 Actual. Chen's voice came through clearly on the command frequency. We have casualties and are taking effective fire from multiple positions. Request immediate close air support and medical evacuation for 2 urgent surgical cases. Harper's blood ran cold. 2 urgent surgical soldiers who would die without immediate medical intervention. Despite her efforts to protect Chen's squad, the ambush had succeeded in inflicting casualties that could prove fatal without rapid treatment. The nearest medical facility was 45 minutes away by helicopter, assuming that air assets were immediately available and that landing zones could be secured under fire. Through her scope, Harper could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. The insurgents had adjusted their positions to account for her interference, and they were now coordinating a final assault that would overrun Chen's defensive position within the next few minutes. Air support wouldn't arrive in time. Medical evacuation was impossible while the landing zone remained contested, and reinforcements were too far away to affect the immediate tactical situation. Harper Moore was the only person who could save Chen's squad, but doing so would require her to abandon every principle of concealment and operational security that had kept her alive for the past 3 years. She would have to reveal herself, expose her position, and almost certainly compromise the entire program that had made her legendary. Mission possible. The decision took approximately 3 seconds to make because Harper Moore had spent her entire adult life preparing for moments when impossible choices had to be made instantly and lived with forever. She began with her 7th shot, a deliberately placed round that created a spectacular explosion in an abandoned fuel drum positioned directly behind the insurgents' main firing position. The explosion provided both visual cover for Chen's squad to reposition and psychological effect on the attackers, who suddenly found themselves caught between unknown explosives and an invisible sniper who seemed to anticipate their every movement. 8th shot eliminated the insurgent field commander who was attempting to reorganize his scattered forces. Her 9th shot took out a machine gun team that was preparing to suppress Chen's new position. Her 10th shot killed the radio operator who was coordinating with external support elements that Harper knew were en route to reinforce the ambush. But Harper's 11th shot was different. Instead of targeting enemy personnel, She aimed at a specific structural weakness in the building where the insurgents had positioned their command element. The shot was calculated to cause a controlled collapse that would eliminate multiple enemy positions, while creating debris that would block the approaches Chun's squad had been using for their tactical withdrawal. The building came down exactly as Harper had calculated, but the collapse also created a dust cloud that obscured visibility for nearly 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, Harper made a decision that would change everything about her mission and her life. She left her concealed position and moved into direct support of Chun's squad, moving at night through hostile territory while carrying a precision rifle system that weighed 47 pounds, required physical conditioning, tactical knowledge, and mental discipline that few people possessed. Harper covered the distance between her hide and Chun's position in 12 minutes, navigating obstacles and potential ambush sites, while maintaining awareness of the tactical situation that was continuing to develop around her. She arrived at Chun's perimeter just as the insurgents were preparing their final assault. 3 soldiers were wounded, 2 with serious injuries that would require immediate surgical intervention, 1 with minor wounds that wouldn't prevent him from continuing to fight. The squad's medic was working frantically to stabilize the most seriously wounded soldier, while Chun coordinated defensive preparations and called for support that might not arrive in time to matter. Harper's appearance at their perimeter should have been impossible. She materialized out of darkness and chaos like a figure from mythology, wearing gear that none of them recognized and carrying weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum of advanced warfare. But more than her equipment, it was her presence itself that was extraordinary calm, competent, and utterly confident in a situation where trained soldiers were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. "Who the hell are you?" Chun demanded, his rifle trained on Harper even as his tactical instincts told him that anyone who could approach their position undetected was probably not an enemy. "Someone who's been keeping you alive for the past 6 months. Harper replied, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "And someone who needs you to follow my instructions. Exactly if you want to survive the next 10 minutes. Chun's squad stared at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to suspicion to desperate hope. They had been fighting a war where invisible enemies killed from shadows and safety was always temporary. The idea that they had been protected by an equally invisible guardian was both impossible to believe and impossible to dismiss. "Prove it," Chun said, his weapon still raised but his finger moving away from the trigger. Harper's response was to fire her 12th shot of the evening, a precise round that eliminated an insurgent sniper who had been positioning himself to take a killing shot at Chun from a concealed position 200 meters away. Creating these detailed military stories requires extensive research and countless hours of writing. If this story is keeping you engaged, please hit the like button and share it with others who appreciate military fiction. The insurgent's rifle clattered to the ground, and Chun realized that he had been approximately 30 seconds away from death when the mysterious woman had saved his life. "The medical evacuation helicopter will be here in 7 minutes. Harper continued, her voice never changing tone despite the gunfire that was continuing around their position. "But the landing zone isn't secure, and there are at least 15 insurgents still active in the area. I'm going to clear the LZ, and you're going to get your wounded soldiers ready for immediate transport." "That's impossible," Chun replied. "There's too much hostile fire, too many enemy positions. One person can't." Harper's 13th shot interrupted his protest, eliminating a machine gun team that had been preparing to suppress the landing zone. Her 14th shot took out a rocket-propelled grenade gunner who was positioning himself to engage the incoming helicopter. Her 15th shot killed the tactical coordinator who was directing the insurgents' efforts to prevent medical evacuation. "One person can't," Harper agreed as she continued to systematically eliminate threats with a precision and speed that defied everything. Chen thought he knew about combat operations, but I'm not just one person. I'm the reason you've survived every impossible situation for the past 6 months. I'm the reason your squad has the best survival rate in the entire theater. I'm the reason you're going to go home to your daughter instead of in a flag-draped coffin. The mention of his daughter stopped Chen cold. The information wasn't classified, but it wasn't something he discussed with anyone in his unit, and it certainly wasn't something that a random sniper should have known. Harper's knowledge of personal details that she shouldn't have possessed was more unsettling than her supernatural shooting ability, because it suggested a level of surveillance and intelligence gathering that implied resources far beyond what any individual operator should have had access to. "Who are you working for?" Chen demanded, but his question was interrupted by the distinctive sound of an approaching helicopter. "Right now I'm working for you," Harper replied as she chambered her 16th round and began scanning for additional threats. "Medic, get your casualties ready for immediate evacuation. The bird will be on the ground for exactly 90 seconds, and if we don't have this LZ clear by then, everyone dies." The next 4 minutes were a masterpiece of coordinated tactical action. Harper positioned herself to provide overwatch while Chen's squad prepared their wounded soldiers for medical evacuation. Her 16th through 21st shots eliminated insurgents who were attempting to engage the incoming helicopter with small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades. Each shot was placed with mathematical precision, taking into account not just the immediate threat but the tactical implications of each elimination. The medical evacuation helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, its crew already prepared to receive casualties. Chen's 2 most seriously wounded soldiers were loaded aboard in less than 60 seconds. Their medical status stabilized enough to survive the flight to the nearest trauma center. The helicopter lifted off exactly on schedule, disappearing into the night sky while Harper continued to provide covering fire against insurgents, who were attempting one final assault on the extraction site. But as the helicopter departed and the immediate crisis passed, Harper realized that everything had changed irrevocably. She had revealed herself to an entire squad of American soldiers, demonstrated capabilities that couldn't be explained through conventional military training, and displayed knowledge of classified information that would inevitably trigger investigations. At the highest levels of military intelligence, Harper Moore, the ghost who had protected American forces while remaining completely invisible, no longer existed. In saving Chen's squad, she had sacrificed the operational security that had made her mission possible. "The insurgents are withdrawing," Chen observed as the volume of enemy fire decreased noticeably. "Whatever you did, it worked." Harper nodded, but her attention was focused on tactical considerations that extended far beyond the immediate engagement. The insurgents weren't withdrawing because they had been defeated. They were withdrawing because their primary objective had been achieved. They had forced Harper to reveal herself, to expose the existence of a program that was supposed to remain completely deniable. Someone had planned this entire operation not to kill Chen, but to flush Harper Moore out of the shadows. And that someone had succeeded. "We need to move," Harper said, already beginning to disassemble her rifle for rapid transport. "This position will be compromised within the hour. Your backup units will be here in 20 minutes, but by then there will be other people looking for us, and some of those people aren't going to be friendly." Chen's tactical instincts were excellent, and he immediately understood the implications of Harper's statement. If there were American forces looking for Harper who weren't friendly, it meant that her existence was known to people who considered her a threat rather than an asset. It meant that the woman who had been protecting his squad was herself in danger from the very military structure she had been serving. "Come with us," Chen said, his decision made with the kind of instant certainty that separated effective leaders from people who simply held leadership positions. Whatever program you're part of, whatever orders you're operating under, you've saved my soldiers tonight. That makes you family, and we don't abandon family." Harper's response was a smile that contained equal parts gratitude and sadness. Chen's offer was genuine, born from the kind of loyalty and moral clarity that had made him worth protecting in the first place. But accepting his protection would put his entire squad in danger from people who had resources and authority that exceeded anything Chen could muster in response. "I can't," Harper said simply. "But I need you to promise me something. When they debrief you about tonight, when they ask you about the sniper who saved your squad, tell them the truth about everything except my face. Describe my gear, my weapons, my tactics, my capabilities. But tell them you never got a clear look at my face. Why? Because Harper Moore needs to disappear completely, and the only way that happens is if no one can describe what Harper Moore looks like." Chen studied Harper's face in the dim light, memorizing features that he was being asked to forget. He saw a woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, with dark hair and brown eyes that carried the kind of weariness that came from making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. But more than her physical appearance, he saw someone who had spent years sacrificing everything personal for a mission that demanded complete self-erasure. "What's your real name?" Chen asked. Harper was quiet for a long moment, considering whether to answer a question that could compromise operational security in ways that might extend far beyond her own safety. But she had already crossed every line that mattered tonight, and Chen had earned the right to know who had been protecting him. "Sarah," she said finally. "My real name is Sarah Henderson, and I used to live in a small town in Montana where the biggest danger was getting snowed in during winter storms." The admission felt like removing a weight that she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Sarah Henderson had been dead for so many years that speaking her name aloud felt like resurrection and funeral combined. "Sarah Henderson," Chen repeated, committing the name to memory in a way that suggested it would never be spoken aloud, but would never be forgotten. "Thank you, Sarah Henderson, for keeping my soldiers alive." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation, Chen's backup units arriving to secure the area and investigate the engagement. Harper had perhaps 3 minutes before her position would be overrun by American soldiers who would want to debrief her, document her, and ultimately integrate her into official channels that would destroy everything she had spent years building. "Maria will be monitoring radio communications," Harper said as she completed her preparations for immediate departure. "If you ever need help, if your unit ever faces a situation that's beyond your ability to handle, have your communications specialist broadcast Guardian Angel on frequency 147.3 MHz at exactly 0300 hours. Someone will be listening, and someone will respond. Will that someone be you?" Harper's smile was answer enough. She melted back into the darkness with the same supernatural stealth that had brought her to Chen's position, leaving behind only the tactical evidence of her intervention and the lingering sense that Chen's squad had been touched by something extraordinary. But as Harper made her way back through hostile territory toward the safe house where Maria was waiting, she carried with her the knowledge that tonight had been both her greatest triumph and the beginning of the end of everything she had spent years becoming. She had saved Chen's squad, neutralized HVT-7's operation, and demonstrated that Harper Moore was more than just a ghost story told around military campfires. She had also exposed herself to people who would never stop looking for her, compromised. A program that had taken years to develop and crossed operational lines that could never be uncrossed. Harper Moore had saved lives tonight, but in doing so, she had signed her own death warrant. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 3 years becoming a legend that nobody knew existed, and in one night of revealed heroism, she had become a target that everybody would be hunting. As she disappeared into the Afghan night, Harper Moore was already beginning to plan her own disappearance. Because legends, by definition, weren't supposed to be real. And real people, in her line of work, weren't supposed to survive long enough to become legends. The safe house was burning when Harper arrived at 0347 hours. 3 hours after her confrontation with Chun's squad, and 2 hours after she had made the decision that would define everything that came afterward. The flames were controlled, professional, not the chaotic destruction of combat damage, but the methodical elimination of evidence that spoke to intelligence operatives who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to destroy it completely. Maria was gone. Harper approached the burning structure with the caution that had kept her alive through situations where caution was the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. Her equipment was still functional, her skills were still sharp, but her emotional state was fractured in ways that made tactical decision-making exponentially more difficult. Maria hadn't just been her partner. She had been the last connection. Harper had to anything resembling a normal human relationship. The tactical situation was clear. Enough. The safe house had been compromised, Maria had been captured or eliminated, and Harper was now completely alone in hostile territory with limited resources and no support structure. But the implications went far beyond tactical considerations. The safe house location was known only to Harper, Maria, and their handlers in the program that had created Harper Moore. If the safe house had been compromised, it meant that the compromise came from within the program itself, someone inside. The organization that had created Harper Moore had decided that Harper Moore needed to be eliminated. Harper circled the burning building twice, using skills learned during survival training that had prepared her for exactly this scenario. She found signs of a struggle-disturbed earth, blood spatter that had been partially cleaned but not completely eliminated, tire tracks from vehicles that had arrived and departed under circumstances that suggested urgency rather than routine operations. But she also found something that made her blood freeze: Maria's emergency cache, buried beneath a pile of stones that would have appeared random to anyone who didn't know the specific pattern that identified it as a dead drop. The cache contained encrypted communications, emergency identification documents, and a handwritten note that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. Harper, the note read in Maria's distinctive handwriting, "If you're reading this, then everything we suspected about the program has been confirmed. They've decided that we know too much, that we've become a liability rather than an asset. They're cleaning house, and we're on the list of people who need to be cleaned up. I've left you everything I could gather about the real scope of the program and the people who run it. Use it wisely, trust no one in official channels, and remember that Sarah Henderson was a good person who deserved better than what happened to her. Don't let Harper Moore suffer the same fate." The encrypted files in Maria's cache painted a picture of an organization that was vastly more complex and morally ambiguous than Harper had ever imagined. The program that had created Harper Moore was not an official military operation, despite using military resources and personnel. It was a hybrid intelligence operation that drew funding from multiple sources, operated across multiple theaters, and answered to people whose names appeared on no organizational charts. More disturbing were the personnel files that Maria had somehow accessed during her final hours of freedom. Harper Moore was not unique. There were at least 7 other operatives with similar backgrounds, similar training, and similar operational parameters. They were all women, all recruited from military backgrounds where they had demonstrated exceptional skill and absolute reliability, and all had been given new identities that completely erased their previous lives. But according to Maria's research, Harper Moore was the only one still active. The other 6 operatives had been retired over the past 18 months. Their missions terminated and their new identities dissolved back into the bureaucratic void that had created them. Maria's notes suggested that retirement in this context was a euphemism for permanent elimination. Harper was the last ghost in a program that was systematically eliminating its own ghosts. The realization brought with it a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. Harper Moore had been created to be expendable, had been trained to be deniable, and had been deployed with the understanding that her operational lifespan would be measured in years rather than decades. But she had also been trained to be exceptionally good at staying alive in situations where other people wanted her dead. The people who had created Harper Moore were about to discover that they had created someone who was very difficult to kill. Harper spent the next 6 hours conducting surveillance of the area around the destroyed safe house, using techniques that would identify anyone who was monitoring the site for her return. She found evidence of at least 3 separate observation posts, all professionally established and manned by people who understood counterintelligence procedures. But she also found something that suggested the operation against her was not entirely one-sided, signs that Maria had not been taken easily, and that at least 2 of her captors had been wounded in the process. Maria Santos had gone down fighting, which meant that she had probably managed to transmit at least some intelligence about the people who had taken her before her communications were severed. If Harper could access those transmissions, she might be able to determine who was hunting her and why they had decided that Harper Moore needed to be eliminated. The communications intercept required Harper to take risks that violated every principle of operational security she had learned over the past 3 years. She had to approach within 50 meters of an active observation post, deploy electronic surveillance equipment that would be detectable by anyone monitoring radio frequencies, and maintain that position for nearly an hour while the equipment attempted to decrypt transmissions that had been encrypted using protocols she only partially understood. But the intelligence she gathered was worth the risk. Maria had indeed managed to transmit critical information during the final moments before her capture. The people hunting Harper Moore were not just program administrators cleaning up loose ends. They were representatives of a competing intelligence organization that wanted to capture Harper alive and extract information about operational procedures that could be used to compromise other programs. Harper Moore was not being eliminated because she was expendable. She was being hunted because she was valuable. The distinction was crucial because it changed the tactical calculus entirely. If Harper was being eliminated as a security risk, then her best option would be to disappear completely, to shed the Harper Moore identity and create a new life that had no connection to military or intelligence operations. But if she was being hunted for what she knew, then disappearing would only delay the inevitable. Eventually, the people hunting her would find her, and when they did, they would extract every piece of operational intelligence she possessed before eliminating her as a security risk. Harper's only viable option was to go on the offensive, to identify the people hunting her, neutralize them before they could capture her, and expose the program that had created her in ways that would make her elimination more politically costly than her continued existence. It was a strategy that required her to become everything that Harper Moore had been trained to avoid: visible, traceable, and officially acknowledged. She would have to abandon the shadows that had protected her and fight a war in the light, where her enemies had every conceivable advantage. But Harper Moore had spent 3 years learning to fight impossible battles against overwhelming odds. This would simply be the most personal and possible battle of her career. The first phase of Harper's counteroffensive began with intelligence gathering on the scale that she had never attempted as an individual operator. Using skills that Maria had taught her and resources that she had never expected to need, Harper began systematically identifying the people who were hunting her. She intercepted their communications, analyzed their operational patterns, and constructed detailed profiles of individuals who had assumed they were completely invisible to the people they were hunting. The operation required Harper to move constantly, never staying in one location for more than a few hours, using safe houses and supply caches that she established through a network of contacts who had no idea they were supporting a fugitive intelligence operative. She paid for information with medical supplies stolen from military facilities, traded weapons maintenance for temporary shelter, and leveraged the kind of reputation that Harper Moore had built over months of protecting American soldiers. Because word had spread, despite Chen's efforts to follow Harper's instructions about maintaining operational security. The story of the mysterious sniper who had saved Chen's squad was being told around forward operating bases across Afghanistan, embellished and mythologized with each retelling, but retaining enough accuracy to identify Harper's distinctive operational signature. Harper Moore was becoming famous in exactly the way that she had spent years trying to avoid. But fame, she discovered, could be a weapon as well as a vulnerability. When she approached soldiers with requests for assistance, they responded not as strangers helping a stranger, but as people who owed debts to someone who had been protecting them without their knowledge. The legend of Harper Moore had become a currency that she could spend in pursuit of the intelligence she needed to stay alive. The second phase of Harper's counteroffensive began when she identified the first person who was hunting her, Colonel James Mitchell, a career intelligence officer who had been involved in the original development of the program that created Harper Moore, and who was now working for a private military contractor that specialized in operations too sensitive for official military channels. Mitchell's operational pattern was methodical, professional, and utterly predictable to someone who understood how military intelligence officers conducted manhunts in hostile territory. He established a base of operations, deployed assets in a systematic search pattern, and gradually contracted the search area until his target was isolated and captured. Harper's response was to turn Mitchell's methodology against him. She began by identifying his base of operations, a compound outside Kabul that was officially designated as a logistics facility, but which Harper's surveillance revealed was actually a command center for intelligence operations that had no official existence. Then she began systematically eliminating Mitchell's assets, one by one, using tactics that were designed to demonstrate that his hunter had become the hunted. Mitchell's first operative disappeared during a routine surveillance mission, found 3 days later with a single gunshot wound and a note that read, "Harper Moore sends her regards." His second operative was eliminated while conducting a radio intercept operation, his equipment destroyed and his communications protocols compromised in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of intelligence procedures. But Harper's masterstroke was her treatment of Mitchell's third operative, a woman named Captain Lisa Park, who had been recruited from Army Special Operations and trained in many of the same techniques that had been used to create Harper Moore. Instead of eliminating Park, Harper captured her, debriefed her extensively, and then released her with a message that was designed to maximize psychological impact on Mitchell's operation. "Tell Mitchell," Harper instructed Park during the final moments of her captivity, "that Harper Moore is no longer running. Tell him that Harper Moore is hunting him. Tell him that he created something he doesn't understand, and now he's going to learn what that something is capable of when it decides to stop protecting people and starts eliminating them." Park's debriefing to Mitchell was recorded by Harper's electronic surveillance equipment, and the recording confirmed that Harper's psychological warfare was having exactly the intended effect. Mitchell's voice carried undertones of fear and uncertainty that suggested his confidence in the operation was beginning to deteriorate. But the recording also revealed something that fundamentally changed Harper's understanding of the situation. Mitchell was not the architect of the operation against her. He was a subordinate following orders from someone whose identity was being carefully concealed, even from operatives at Mitchell's level. Harper Moore was being hunted by people who were so highly placed, so carefully protected, that even senior intelligence officers didn't know who they were. The third phase of Harper's counteroffensive required her to do something that violated every instinct she had developed over 3 years of covert operations. She had to make herself visible to official channels, to approach people who might be able to help her identify the architects of the program that was trying to eliminate her. Her first contact was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen. Harper approached Chen during a routine patrol briefing at Forward Operating Base Chapman, materializing in his command post with the same supernatural stealth that had characterized her previous interventions. But this time, she wasn't there to provide protection from enemy forces. She was there to request protection from her own side. "I need your help," Harper told Chen without preamble, her usual operational security completely abandoned in favor of direct communication. "The people who created Harper Moore are trying to kill Harper Moore, and I don't have anyone else I can trust." Chen's response was immediate and unequivocal. "What do you need?" The simplicity of his offer, the complete absence of questions about authorization or official channels, confirmed Harper's assessment of Chen's character and explained why he had been worth protecting for so long. Marcus Chen was the kind of officer who made decisions based on moral clarity rather than bureaucratic convenience, and moral clarity was exactly what Harper needed. "I need access to military intelligence databases," Harper said. "I need to identify the people who are hunting me, and I need to do it before they capture or eliminate me." Chen's access to classified databases was extensive, but not unlimited. As a lieutenant colonel with special operations experience and multiple combat deployments, he could access operational intelligence, personnel files, and communications intercepts. That would be invaluable to Harper's investigation. But he couldn't access the highest levels of strategic intelligence without triggering alerts that would compromise both of their positions. "We'll have to be careful," Chen warned as he began accessing the databases Harper had requested. "If someone is monitoring these queries, they'll know exactly what we're looking for." "They already know I'm looking for them," Harper replied. "The question is whether we can find them before they find us." The database searches revealed a pattern that was both illuminating and disturbing. The program that had created Harper Moore was funded through a maze of shell companies, operated through a network of contractors with no official government connections, and supervised by people whose names appeared in no official records. But the financial transactions that supported the program could be traced, and those traces led back to a small group of individuals who had been involved in intelligence operations for decades. At the center of that group was a name that made Harper's blood run cold: General Patricia Hawthorne, a career intelligence officer who had been instrumental in developing special operations capabilities during the early years of the Afghanistan conflict, and who was now serving in a position that gave her access to resources and authority that extended across multiple government agencies. General Hawthorne was not just hunting Harper Moore. She was the person who had originally authorized Harper Moore's creation, and she was now eliminating the program she had created because it had become politically inconvenient to maintain. Harper Moore had been betrayed by the person who had given her life, purpose, and identity, and that person was now trying to eliminate her as thoroughly as she had originally created her. Revelation brought with it a fury that Harper had never experienced, because it was personal in ways that transcended tactical considerations or professional obligations. General Hawthorne had not just created Harper Moore. She had destroyed Sarah Henderson in the process, and now she was trying to destroy Harper Moore as well. But Harper Moore was not Sarah Henderson, and Harper Moore had been trained to be very good at destroying people who threatened her survival. General Patricia Hawthorne died at 0623 hours on a Tuesday morning in her private office at the Pentagon, killed by a single shot fired from a distance of 847 meters, through a window that intelligence experts would later determine could not have been accessed by any conventional means. The bullet that killed her was a .308 caliber round that had been hand-loaded to specifications that existed in no official military manual, fired from a rifle that had been modified beyond all recognition by a woman who had officially died in a helicopter crash 5 years earlier. Harper Moore had spent 3 weeks planning General Hawthorne's assassination with the same methodical precision she had applied to protecting American soldiers in Afghanistan. The operation required her to infiltrate the most secure military installation in the world, establish a shooting position that provided clear lines of sight while remaining undetectable, and eliminate a target who was surrounded by multiple layers of security designed to prevent exactly the kind of attack that Harper was planning. But Harper Moore had been trained by the best intelligence operatives in the world, using resources that exceeded anything available to conventional military forces, and she had been trained specifically to accomplish missions that other people would consider impossible. The assassination itself was flawless. Harper's shot was placed with mathematical precision, instantly fatal, and left no forensic evidence that could be traced back to any official source. General Hawthorne simply died at her desk while reviewing classified documents, killed by what the subsequent investigation would describe as an unknown sniper using unconventional tactics and advanced equipment. But the assassination was only the beginning of Harper's resolution of the situation that had destroyed her life and threatened her survival. Before killing General Hawthorne, Harper had spent 2 weeks systematically documenting every aspect of the program that had created her. She had accessed classified databases, intercepted communications between program operatives, and compiled evidence that demonstrated the scope and illegality of operations that had been conducted without oversight or authorization from any official government body. The documentation painted a picture of an intelligence program that had operated completely outside legal boundaries, recruiting operatives through deception, deploying them in operations that violated international law, and eliminating them when they became politically inconvenient. Harper Moore was not the first operative to be targeted for elimination. She was simply the first to be skilled enough and resourceful enough to fight back effectively. Harper's evidence package included detailed financial records showing how the program had been funded through shell companies and offshore accounts, personnel files documenting the recruitment and training of operatives who had believed they were serving their country, and communications records that revealed the systematic elimination of people who had devoted their lives to protecting American interests. But most damaging were the recordings Harper had obtained of General Hawthorne's conversations with other program administrators, discussions that revealed a cavalier attitude toward the lives of operatives and a willingness to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to the program's secrecy. "We created these people to be expendable," Hawthorne's voice was recorded saying during one particularly damning conversation. "Their entire value lies in their deniability. When they become undeniable, they become worthless." Harper's response to that recording was simple. She made it undeniable that General Patricia Hawthorne had created a program designed to use and discard American soldiers. And then she made General Patricia Hawthorne expendable. The evidence package was delivered simultaneously to 14 different recipients: journalists who specialized in national security reporting, members of Congress who served on intelligence oversight committees, military officers who had the authority and integrity to demand investigations, and international human rights organizations that could apply external pressure for accountability. But Harper's masterstroke was her decision to send copies of all the evidence to Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, along with authorization to distribute the information to any person or organization that he deemed appropriate. Chen's response was swift and devastating. Within 72 hours of receiving Harper's evidence package, he had briefed senior military officials, congressional investigators, and journalists who began publishing stories that revealed the scope and illegality of operations that had been conducted in the name of national security. The political firestorm was immediate and overwhelming. Congressional hearings were announced, criminal investigations were opened, and military officials who had been aware of the program but had chosen to ignore its implications were forced to resign or face court-martial proceedings. But more importantly, Chen used his position and credibility to ensure that the story focused on the heroism of operatives like Harper Moore, rather than just the crimes of administrators like General Hawthorne. His testimony before Congress painted a picture of soldiers who had been betrayed by the people they trusted most, who had sacrificed everything in service to their country, and who deserved recognition and protection rather than elimination and denial. Master Sergeant Sarah Henderson, Chen testified, using Harper's real name for the first time in any official context, saved my life and the lives of dozens of other American soldiers. She did so while operating under conditions that would have broken most people, using skills that she had developed through years of dedicated service, and accepting risks that she knew could result in her death or capture. Chen's testimony continued for 3 hours, detailing specific instances where Harper's intervention had saved American lives, describing the precision and professionalism that had characterized her operations, and demanding that the military take responsibility for protecting someone who had spent years protecting others. The impact was immediate and profound. Within days of Chen's testimony, the Secretary of Defense announced the creation of a special commission to investigate intelligence programs that had operated without proper oversight. The Attorney General opened criminal investigations into individuals who had authorized illegal operations. And most importantly, the military issued official pardons and recognition for operatives who had been targeted for elimination after years of faithful service to Master Sergeant Sarah Henderson was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for actions that had previously been classified beyond all recognition. Harper Moore was granted full immunity from prosecution and offered complete protection from anyone who might seek retaliation for her exposure of the program. But the most meaningful recognition came from soldiers who had served in Afghanistan during the period when Harper had been operating as their invisible guardian. As news of her identity and actions spread through military channels, Harper began receiving communications from soldiers who had survived impossible situations, who had experienced miraculous interventions, who had always suspected that someone was watching over them during their darkest moments. The communications painted a picture of a woman who had spent years sacrificing everything personal for the preservation of other people's lives. They described incidents where perfectly timed sniper fire had eliminated threats that soldiers hadn't even seen, where explosions had been triggered at exactly the right moments to provide cover for tactical withdrawals, where medical evacuations had been made possible by the elimination of hostile forces that should have made extraction impossible. Harper Moore had saved hundreds of lives while remaining completely anonymous. And now those lives were testifying to her worth in ways that no official recognition could match. But perhaps the most important communication came from Maria Santos, who had not been killed during her capture, but had been held prisoner while program administrators attempted to extract information about Harper's capabilities and operational procedures. Maria had been released immediately after General Hawthorne's assassination, when the people holding her realized that their operation had been compromised beyond any possibility of recovery. "You did it," Maria wrote in her first communication. "After being freed, you not only survived, you won. You exposed them. You protected the people they were trying to eliminate, and you made it impossible for them to continue operations that were destroying good soldiers for bad reasons." Sarah Henderson would be proud of what Harper Moore accomplished. The transition from Harper Moore back to Sarah Henderson was gradual, complex, and emotionally devastating in ways that Harper had not anticipated. For 3 years, she had suppressed everything personal about Sarah Henderson in order to become Harper Moore completely. The process of reclaiming her original identity required her to confront emotions, memories, and relationships that she had buried so deeply that she had almost convinced herself they no longer existed. The military provided psychological support, medical care, and financial resources to help Harper transition back to civilian life. But the most important support came from Marcus Chen, who had become not just an ally but a friend, who understood the unique challenges faced by someone who had spent years living multiple lives for the sake of serving others. Chen's recommendation led to Harper's appointment as a consultant for special operations training, where she could use her skills to teach other soldiers how to survive in hostile environments without requiring them to sacrifice their identities or their humanity. It was work that allowed her to continue serving her country while remaining true to the person she had been before the program changed her life. But Harper's most important contribution was her insistence that programs like the one that had created her should never be allowed to exist again. She worked with congressional investigators to develop oversight mechanisms that would prevent intelligence agencies from recruiting operatives through deception, deploying them in illegal operations, and eliminating them when they became politically inconvenient. Her recommendations became the foundation for legislation that fundamentally changed how special operations personnel were recruited, trained, and supported throughout their careers. The Sarah Henderson Act, as it became known, established legal protections for operatives who exposed illegal activities, created independent oversight bodies to monitor classified programs, and guaranteed support for soldiers who had been harmed by operations that exceeded their authorized parameters. The law was not just a tribute to Harper's service. It was a promise that future soldiers would not be required to sacrifice their identities, their relationships, and their humanity in order to serve their country effectively. As Harper worked to rebuild a life that had been interrupted by years of official non-existence, she found herself returning frequently to Afghanistan in her mind, remembering soldiers who had survived impossible situations because someone they never saw had been watching over them. The memories were painful but also deeply satisfying, because they represented the most meaningful work she had ever done. But the memory that sustained her most was the evening when she had revealed herself to Marcus Chen's squad, when she had abandoned every principle of operational security in order to save lives that mattered more than missions. That night, Harper Moore had chosen to be human rather than invisible, and that choice had ultimately saved not just Chen's soldiers, but Harper herself. 2 years after General Hawthorne's assassination, Harper returned to Afghanistan as a civilian contractor, working with military units to develop training programs that would help soldiers survive combat deployments without requiring them to become people they weren't. The work brought her full circle, allowing her to use skills developed as Harper Moore in service of goals that honored Sarah Henderson's original commitment to protecting people who needed protection. On her first day back in Afghanistan, Harper visited the abandoned school building where she had positioned herself to save Chen's squad. The children's drawings were still there, faded by time and weather, but somehow still defiant in their expression of hope for a world without war. Harper added her own drawing to the wall, a simple sketch of mountains and sky, signed with both of her names, Sarah Henderson, who became Harper Moore, who learned to be Sarah Henderson again. It was a reminder that identity was not something that could be issued or revoked by official channels, but something that belonged to the person who claimed it and held onto it despite everything that tried to take it away. As Harper walked away from the school, she knew that she would never again be the invisible guardian she had been during her years as Harper Moore, but she also knew that she would never stop being someone who protected people who needed protection, who stood between harm and innocence, who chose to be human, even when being human was the most dangerous choice she could make. Harper Moore had been a legend that nobody knew existed. Sarah Henderson was becoming someone whose existence proved that legends could be real, and real people could choose to be legendary. 3 years later, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered to Sarah Henderson's address in Missoula, Montana, where she had built a life that was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. The return address indicated it had been sent from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, but the handwriting was unmistakably that of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, though his rank insignia had changed to colonel since their last official communication. Sarah, the letter began, using the name she had reclaimed and the identity she had fought to preserve. I wanted you to know that the training program you helped design has saved lives. Real, measurable, documented lives of soldiers who came home because they learned techniques that you developed through experience that nobody should have to gain the hard way. Sarah smiled as she read Chun's careful prose, recognizing the diplomatic language of an officer who knew that certain conversations could never be entirely secure, even years after the events that had bonded them in ways that transcended normal military relationships. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing developments that Chun thought would interest her. The expansion of the survival training program to all special operations units, the implementation of oversight protocols that had prevented the creation of new black programs, the promotion and recognition of soldiers who had been targeted for elimination by the same people who had tried to destroy Harper Moore. But the most meaningful part of the letter was its conclusion. The legend of the guardian angel is still being told in forward operating bases around the world. Soldiers who never knew your name tell stories about impossible saves, miraculous interventions, the sense that someone was watching over them in their darkest moments. They don't know that their guardian angel was a woman from Montana who chose to sacrifice everything personal for their survival. But I know, and I make sure that the people who matter also know, you are not forgotten, Sarah Henderson. You are remembered every time a soldier comes home who shouldn't have survived, but did. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in a wooden box that contained similar communications from soldiers whose lives had intersected with hers during her years as Harper Moore. The box was not large, but it represented a legacy that extended far beyond any official recognition or military decoration. She had been living in Missoula for 18 months, long enough to establish routines that felt almost normal, but not long enough to forget. That normalcy was a luxury she had earned through years of abnormal service. Her house was small, comfortable, and positioned with careful attention to tactical considerations that most people would never notice. Multiple escape routes, clear fields of observation, defensive advantages that could be activated quickly if her past ever caught up with her present. But the most important feature of her house was its ordinariness. Sarah Henderson lived like a person who had never been anyone other than Sarah Henderson, who had never killed people to save people, who had never been a legend that existed only in whispered stories told around military campfires. The work she did now was related to her previous skills, but removed from the immediate life and death consequences that had defined her years as Harper Moore. She consulted with military training facilities, developing curricula that taught survival skills, tactical awareness, and the psychological resilience required for extended deployments in hostile environments. The work allowed her to serve soldiers without requiring them to pay the prices she had paid, and without requiring her to become someone other than herself. But Sarah also worked with organizations that supported veterans transitioning back to civilian life, particularly those who had served in classified programs or special operations roles that left them feeling disconnected from the people and communities they had served to protect. She understood, in ways that few people could, the challenge of rebuilding an identity after years of professional self-ERISUR. Her most meaningful work was with women veterans who had served in combat roles, helping them navigate the particular challenges faced by female soldiers who had excelled in environments where their presence was often questioned or resented. Sarah had learned to talk about her own experiences carefully, revealing enough of Harper Moore's story to provide credible guidance without exposing operational details that remained classified. The hardest part, she would tell women who were struggling with the transition from military to civilian life, is not learning to be a person again. It's learning to be yourself again, after years of being exactly the person that other people needed you to be. The advice was drawn from her own ongoing struggle to balance Sarah Henderson's natural personality with skills and instincts that Harper Moore had developed through necessity. Some days, Sarah caught herself scanning for threats that didn't exist, planning escape routes from situations that required no escape, thinking tactically about circumstances that called for nothing more complex than human interaction. But other days, Sarah remembered what it felt like to laugh at jokes that weren't operationally relevant, to make decisions based on personal preference rather than mission requirements, to form relationships that weren't governed by security considerations or tactical necessity. The process of becoming herself again was gradual, imperfect, and ongoing. Some aspects of Harper Moore would always be part of who Sarah Henderson was, because experiences that profound didn't disappear simply because circumstances changed. But Sarah had learned to integrate those experiences rather than being controlled by them, to use skills developed in darkness for purposes that brought light to other people's lives. 5 years later, the documentary premiered on a network that specialized in military history, titled Ghost Stories: The Legend of the Guardian Angel. Sarah watched it alone in her living room, drinking tea and eating popcorn like any other person watching television on a Sunday evening. The documentary was professionally produced, respectfully presented, and entirely inaccurate in its speculation about the identity of the mysterious sniper who had protected American forces in Afghanistan. The filmmakers had interviewed dozens of soldiers who claimed to have been saved by Harper Moore's interventions, military historians who attempted to explain the tactical significance of her operations, and intelligence experts who theorized about the kind of training and resources that would have made her missions possible. But none of them knew who Harper Moore really was, because the people who did know had kept that information secure in ways that transcended official classification levels. Marcus Chen, now a general and serving in a position that gave him significant influence over special operations policies, had been interviewed for the documentary, but had limited his comments to tactical analysis and general observations about the importance of protecting soldiers who served in dangerous environments. Whoever this person was, Chen said during his interview, they demonstrated a level of skill, dedication, and moral courage that represents the very best of what military service can accomplish. They saved lives while remaining completely anonymous, served their country while accepting no recognition, and made sacrifices that most people will never fully understand. The documentary concluded with contemporary footage of Afghanistan, showing forward operating bases where soldiers continued to serve in circumstances that required constant vigilance, extraordinary courage, and the kind of mutual support that Harper Moore had provided from the shadows. The narrator's final words were delivered over images of sunrise in the mountains, where Harper had once moved like a force of nature. The identity of the guardian angel remains unknown, but the legacy of their service continues to inspire soldiers who face impossible odds in service to something larger than themselves. Sarah turned off the television and sat in the darkness of her living room, remembering nights when she had watched similar sunrises after completing missions that saved lives she would never know about, protecting people who would never know her name. The memories were painful but also deeply satisfying, because they represented work that had mattered in ways that transcended personal recognition or official acknowledgement. But the most meaningful part of watching the documentary was the recognition that Harper Moore had become exactly what Sarah had always intended, a story that inspired people to be better than they thought they could be, to serve others even when service required sacrifice, to choose courage even when courage was dangerous. 7 years later, the letter that arrived on Sarah's 41st birthday was different from the others she had received over the years. It was handwritten on expensive stationery, posted from an address in Virginia, and signed by someone whose name Sarah recognized from newspapers and congressional hearings, Senator Patricia Walsh, who had been instrumental in passing legislation that reformed military intelligence operations and provided support for veterans who had served in classified programs. Dear Ms. Henderson, the letter began. Using the formal address that indicated Senator Walsh understood the sensitivity of their communication. I am writing to invite you to participate in a ceremony that recognizes individuals who have served their country with distinction in circumstances that prevented them from receiving appropriate recognition at the time of their service. The ceremony, Senator Walsh explained, was designed to honor veterans whose contributions had been classified or denied for reasons of national security, but whose service had been documented sufficiently to justify official recognition. Sarah's name had been submitted by multiple sources, including senior military officials who had knowledge of her operations and the impact they had achieved. The ceremony will be private, Senator Walsh's letter continued, attended only by family members, fellow veterans, and officials who have clearance to hear details of your service. You will not be required to speak publicly about classified operations, but you will be recognized for achievements that deserve acknowledgement from a grateful nation. Sarah read the letter 3 times before setting it aside to consider her response. The offer represented everything she had once thought she wanted: official recognition, vindication of her choices, acknowledgement that her years as Harper Moore had served purposes that justified their costs. But it also represented something she was no longer certain she needed. Over the 7 years since Harper Moore had been revealed and Sarah Henderson had been reclaimed, Sarah had built a life that was meaningful independent of official recognition. She had helped train soldiers who went on to serve with distinction, supported veterans who needed guidance during difficult transitions, and contributed to reforms that ensured future soldiers would not face the choices that Harper Moore had been forced to make. Most importantly, Sarah had learned to measure her worth through her own standards rather than through acknowledgement from institutions that might or might not understand the true significance of her contributions. Harper Moore had been created by people who thought they understood what she was capable of, and those same people had tried to destroy her when she exceeded their understanding. Sarah Henderson's value was not determined by external validation, but by her own knowledge of work well done in service to purposes that mattered. After a week of consideration, Sarah wrote her reply to Senator Walsh. Thank you for the invitation and for the recognition it represents. However, I must respectfully decline to participate in the ceremony. The most meaningful acknowledgement of my service comes from soldiers who survived deployments they shouldn't have survived, and from the knowledge that future soldiers will be better protected because of reforms that emerged from exposing illegal programs. That recognition is sufficient, and it comes from sources that understand the true significance of the work I was privileged to perform. Sarah sealed the letter, addressed it to Senator Walsh's office, and walked to the post office in downtown Missoula to mail it personally. The act felt symbolic of her complete transition from Harper Moore back to Sarah Henderson. She was making her own choices about how to engage with institutions, based on her own assessment of what served her purposes and values. 10 years later, phone call came on a Thursday evening while Sarah was grading papers for the graduate course she taught at the University of Montana, where she had been appointed as a professor of military psychology with a specialization in veteran transition and trauma recovery. The caller identified himself as Captain David Chen, son of General Marcus Chen, calling from his duty station at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Professor Henderson, the young man said, his voice carrying the same measured professionalism that Sarah remembered from his father's communications. I wanted to thank you for a conversation you probably don't remember having with my father 23 years ago. Sarah set down her pen and gave the call her complete attention. I remember every conversation I had with your father, Captain Chen. What specifically are you referring to? He told me that once, when he was a lieutenant colonel serving in Afghanistan, someone saved his life and the lives of his soldiers under circumstances that should have been impossible. He said that person taught him that serving others sometimes requires sacrificing things that most people would never be willing to sacrifice. and that the highest form of military service is protecting people who will never know they were protected. David Chen continued, "That conversation influenced every decision I made about my military career. I chose infantry because I wanted to serve soldiers directly. I volunteered for special operations because I wanted to develop skills that would let me protect people in circumstances where protection seemed impossible. And I've tried to conduct myself in ways that honor the example of someone who served with such distinction that they became legendary, despite remaining anonymous." Sarah listened to David Chen describe a military career that had been shaped by principles that Harper Moore had embodied, values that Marcus Chen had absorbed and transmitted to his son, who was now serving with the same commitment to protecting. Others that had defined Harper's years as the invisible guardian. "Your father was worth protecting," Sarah said finally. "And from what you've told me, he raised a son who understands why that protection was important." "I have one more thing to tell you," David said. "My father wanted you to know that he named his daughter Sarah in honor of someone who taught him that identity is not something that can be issued or revoked by official channels, but something that belongs to the person who claims it and holds on to it despite everything that tries to take it away." The conversation ended with mutual expressions of respect and gratitude, but Sarah sat in her office for a long time afterward, thinking about the ways that individual actions rippled outward through time, influencing people and events in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Harper Moore had been created to solve specific tactical problems in a particular war at a particular time. But the legacy of Harper Moore extended far beyond those original parameters, inspiring people who had never met her to serve with distinction, influencing policies that protected future soldiers, and demonstrating that individual courage could change systems that seemed impossible to change. 15 years later, Sarah's retirement from the University of Montana was marked by a ceremony that honored her contributions to veteran services and military psychology. But the speakers who praised her work had no idea they were also honoring the service of Harper Moore. Sarah preferred it that way because the separation between her public and classified service allowed her to be recognized for work that she could discuss openly while maintaining the operational security that protected people and programs that remained classified. But the most meaningful recognition of Sarah's career came from students who had gone on to serve in military and civilian roles where they applied principles she had taught them. Letters arrived regularly from former students who were now serving as military officers, therapists specializing in veteran services, policy analysts working on military reform, and researchers developing better methods for supporting soldiers. During difficult transitions, each letter reinforced Sarah's understanding that teaching had been the most important work of her post-military career, because it multiplied her impact in ways that individual operations could never achieve. Harper Moore had saved hundreds of lives through direct action. Professor Sarah Henderson had influenced thousands of lives through education that prepared them to serve others more effectively. As Sarah cleaned out her office during her final week at the university, she found a folder containing research notes from her early years of teaching, when she had been developing curricula that would help military personnel transition from combat roles to civilian life. The notes were filled with insights drawn from her own experience as Harper Moore, carefully disguised as academic research but actually representing hard-won wisdom about the challenge of maintaining humanity while serving in roles that required inhuman capabilities. One note, written in her own handwriting during her first semester of teaching, caught her attention. The goal is not to help veterans forget what they have done in service to their country, but to help them integrate those experiences in ways that honor both their service and their continued growth as human beings. Identity is not erased by experience. It is deepened by the conscious choice to remain oneself, despite circumstances that encourage or require becoming someone else. The note represented everything Sarah had learned about the relationship between Sarah Henderson and Harper Moore, and everything she had tried to teach students who were navigating their own complex relationships between military and civilian identities. 20 years later, the memorial service was held at Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp October morning that reminded Sarah of Afghan dawns when she had watched the sun rise over mountains that had witnessed centuries of conflict. General Marcus Chen had died peacefully at age 71, surrounded by family members who included 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and a legacy of military service that had influenced an entire generation of officers who served with distinction. In circumstances that required extraordinary courage and moral clarity, Sarah attended the service as Professor Emeritus Sarah Henderson, one of many civilian friends who had known Marcus Chen through his post-military work in veteran services and military education reform. She stood with other mourners as Chen's casket was lowered into ground that held the remains of thousands of Americans who had served their country with distinction, and she listened to speeches that praised his contributions to military leadership and his commitment to protecting soldiers who served in dangerous circumstances. But Sarah's most meaningful tribute to Marcus Chen was private, delivered silently as she stood beside his grave after the other mourners had departed. She spoke to him as Harper Moore, speaking to the man whose life she had protected, whose friendship she had treasured, whose example had guided her through the most difficult transitions of her own life. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for understanding who I was when I didn't understand it myself. Thank you for protecting me when I needed protection, for supporting me when I needed support, and for helping me become someone who could serve others without losing myself in the process. Thank you for proving that good people can survive impossible circumstances and go on to make the world incrementally better through their continued existence." As Sarah walked away from Marcus Chen's grave, she carried with her the certainty that their partnership had achieved something that neither of them could have accomplished alone. Chen had been worth protecting not just because of his individual qualities, but because his survival had enabled him to protect and inspire others in ways that multiplied the impact of Harper Moore's original mission. The ripples of their collaboration would continue long after both of them were gone, carried forward by soldiers who served with distinction, policies that protected future veterans, and principles that honored both military service and human dignity. 25 years later, Sarah's 70th birthday was celebrated quietly at her home in Missoula, with a small group of friends who included former students, fellow veterans, and neighbors who knew her as a retired professor who had devoted her life to serving others. The celebration was exactly what Sarah wanted: simple, meaningful, and focused on relationships that had deepened over time through shared commitment to purposes larger than individual recognition. But the most meaningful gift Sarah received was a package that arrived by special delivery, containing documents that had been declassified after 25 years of security review. The documents included official records of Harper Moore's service, operational reports that detailed her missions and their outcomes, and communications between program administrators that revealed the full scope of her contributions to American military operations in Afghanistan. The declassified records confirmed what Sarah had always known but had never seen documented officially. Harper Moore had saved 347 American lives through direct intervention, prevented an estimated 1,200 additional casualties through intelligence operations and tactical disruption of enemy activities, and eliminated 89 high-value targets who had been responsible for attacks against American and Allied forces. But more important than the statistics were personal accounts from soldiers who had been saved by Harper's interventions, many of whom had gone on to distinguished military careers that were made possible by their survival of deployments that should have been fatal. The accounts painted a picture of a woman who had served with extraordinary skill, unwavering commitment, and moral courage that exceeded anything required by official duty assignments. One account written by a soldier who had been protected by Harper during his first deployment and had gone on to serve as a senior non-commissioned officer responsible for training new soldiers, captured the essence of Harper Moore's legacy. I never knew her name, never saw her face, never heard her voice. But I knew she was there, and that knowledge gave me the courage to serve with distinction in circumstances that would have broken me without her protection. Because of her, I came home. Because I came home, I was able to train hundreds of other soldiers who also came home. That's her real legacy, not just the lives she saved directly, but all the lives that were saved by people whose lives she had saved first. Sarah read through the declassified documents carefully, remembering missions that had seemed routine at the time, but which she now understood as part of a larger tapestry of service that had influenced military operations in ways she had never fully appreciated. Each document reinforced her understanding that Harper Moore's work had mattered not just because of its immediate tactical impact, but because of its long-term strategic influence on how America trained, deployed, and supported its military personnel. As Sarah finished reading the documents, she realized that the final accounting of Harper Moore's service had vindicated every choice she had made during those difficult years. The prices she had paid, the isolation, the secrecy, the gradual erosion of personal relationships and civilian identity had been justified by outcomes that exceeded anything she had imagined when she first accepted the mission that transformed Sarah Henderson into Harper Moore. But more importantly, the documents confirmed that Harper Moore's decision to expose the illegal aspects of her program had prevented similar abuses from occurring in subsequent operations. The reforms that emerged from Harper's revelations had protected hundreds of future operatives from being exploited in ways that violated both their rights as soldiers and their dignity as human beings. Harper Moore had saved lives through violence, but her greatest achievement had been saving lives through courage to speak truth to power when truth-telling required risking everything she had spent years building. 30 years later, the letter arrived on Sarah's 75th birthday, written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose fine motor skills had been compromised by age, but whose mind remained sharp. The return address indicated it had been sent from a retirement community in North Carolina, and the signature identified the sender as Maria Santos, writing for the first time in decades to the woman who had been her partner, her friend, and her connection to a life that had demanded everything they had to give. Sarah, the letter began, I hope this letter finds you well and at peace with the choices we made during those years when we were other people serving purposes that seemed larger than ourselves. I have been thinking about you often as my own. Time grows short, remembering the missions we completed together and the friendship that sustained us through circumstances that would have destroyed most partnerships. Maria's letter continued for several pages, describing a life that had been rebuilt carefully after the trauma of capture, torture, and eventual release when Harper's exposure of the program had made Maria's continued imprisonment politically impossible. Like Sarah, Maria had chosen to work with veterans after her military service ended, specializing in helping former intelligence operatives transition to civilian life, while managing the psychological residue of work that could never be discussed openly. I wanted you to know, Maria wrote near the end of her letter, that the work we did together saved more than just the soldiers we protected directly. It saved the idea that individual conscience can triumph over institutional pressure, that personal courage can change systems that seem impossible to change, and that people who serve in darkness can choose to bring light to situations that desperately need illumination. Maria concluded with words that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Harper Moore was the best person I ever knew, and Sarah Henderson is the person Harper Moore was trying to protect through all those years of service. Thank you for showing me that it was possible to serve with distinction while remaining human, and for proving that legends can be real when they are grounded in love for people who deserve protection. Sarah wrote her reply immediately. describing her own journey from Harper Moore back to Sarah Henderson, the work she had done to help other veterans navigate similar transitions, and the satisfaction that came from knowing that their partnership had influenced reforms that protected future soldiers from exploitation and abuse. But most importantly, Sarah wrote about forgiveness for choices made under impossible pressure, forgiveness for consequences that couldn't have been predicted, and forgiveness for the necessity of becoming people they hadn't planned to become in service to purposes that demanded their complete transformation. "We were good soldiers," Sarah wrote to Maria, "and good soldiers sometimes have to make terrible choices in service to necessary purposes. But we were also good people who never forgot that the purpose of our service was to protect other good people from having to make the choices we made." That balance between professional necessity and personal humanity was the most difficult aspect of our work, and I believe we maintained it as well as anyone could have under those circumstances. The correspondence between Sarah and Maria continued for 2 years, until Maria's death at age 73 ended a friendship that had begun in darkness, survived betrayal and danger, and deepened through shared commitment to helping others navigate the complex relationship between military service and civilian identity. 35 years later, Sarah Henderson died quietly on a Thursday morning in March, at age 79, in the small house in Missoula where she had lived for more than 3 decades. She died peacefully, surrounded by friends who had known her as a professor, mentor, and advocate for veterans, but who had no idea they were also mourning the passing of a woman who had become legendary for service that officially never happened. Funeral was simple, respectful, and attended by former students, fellow veterans, and community members who had been touched by Sarah's commitment to helping others rebuild their lives after military service. The speakers praised her contributions to veteran services, her dedication to military psychology research, and her influence on policies that had improved support for soldiers transitioning to civilian life. But the most meaningful tribute came from General David Chen, son of the man Harper Moore had protected, nephew of the daughter who had been named Sarah in Harper's honor, and inheritor of principles that had been passed down through a family whose lives had been saved by a woman they knew only through stories his father had told in carefully guarded moments. "Professor Henderson," General Chen said during his eulogy, "embodied the highest ideals of military service: selfless commitment to protecting others, moral courage to do what was right regardless of personal cost, and dedication to purposes that transcended individual recognition or reward. She served her country with distinction in circumstances that most of us will never fully understand, and then continued serving by helping others navigate the challenges of military life and veteran transition." Chen continued, "But perhaps her greatest achievement was demonstrating that individual conscience can triumph over institutional pressure, that personal courage can change systems that seem impossible to change, and that service to others can be a source of meaning that sustains us through the most difficult circumstances of human experience." After the funeral, General Chen placed a small American flag on Sarah's grave, along with a note that would have been meaningful only to Sarah herself. "Thank you, from all the soldiers who came home because you were watching over them, and from all the soldiers who will come home because of the reforms that emerged from your courage to speak truth to power." Epilogue. 50 years later, the memorial at Fort Bragg was dedicated on a sunny morning in May, 50 years after Harper Moore had first appeared in the mountains of Afghanistan to begin a mission that would save hundreds of lives and influence military policies for generations. The memorial consisted of a simple granite stone engraved with words that captured the essence of service that prioritized others above self, in memory of all who served in darkness so that others could live in light. The dedication ceremony was attended by military leaders, veteran service organizations, and families of soldiers whose lives had been touched by programs that emerged from reforms inspired by Harper Moore's exposure of illegal intelligence operations. The speakers praised the courage of operatives who had served without recognition, the importance of protecting soldiers from exploitation and abuse, and the legacy of service that continued through policies that honored both military effectiveness and human dignity. But the most significant aspect of the memorial was not the ceremony that dedicated it, but the conversations it inspired among soldiers who gathered there to remember people who had served in circumstances that required extraordinary sacrifice. Veterans would tell stories about invisible guardians, miraculous interventions, and the sense that someone had been watching over them during their darkest moments of service. The stories were told without names, without specific details that might compromise security, but with deep appreciation for service that had transcended individual recognition or official acknowledgement. They were stories about the best aspects of military service: commitment to protecting others, willingness to sacrifice for purposes larger than individual ambition, and moral courage to do what was right regardless of personal cost. Among the stories told at the memorial, one was repeated more often than others: the legend of a sniper who had protected American forces in Afghanistan with such skill and dedication that soldiers began to believe in guardian angels who moved through darkness to eliminate threats before they could harm innocent people. The legend had grown over the decades, embellished through retelling but retaining essential truths about service that prioritized others above self, courage that acted without expectation of reward, and commitment that persisted despite circumstances that would have broken most people. It was a legend that inspired soldiers to serve with distinction, veterans to support each other through difficult transitions, and policies that protected military personnel from exploitation and abuse. But most importantly, it was a legend that proved Sarah Henderson's understanding of the relationship between service and identity, that people could become legendary through service to others, that legends could be real when they were grounded in love for people who deserved protection, and that the highest form of service was protecting people who would never know they were protected. As visitors left the memorial and returned to their own lives and service, they carried with them stories that would continue to inspire courage, compassion, and commitment to purposes larger than individual recognition. The legend of Harper Moore would live on, not as a ghost story told around military campfires, but as a reminder that individual conscience could triumph over institutional pressure, that personal courage could change systems that seemed impossible to change, and that service to others could be a source of meaning that transcended even death itself. The sun set over Fort Bragg as the dedication ceremony concluded, casting long shadows across the memorial that honored service without names, sacrifice without recognition, and courage that acted in darkness so that others could live in light. And in that light, the legacy of Sarah Henderson, who had become Harper Moore, who had learned to be Sarah Henderson again, continued to inspire people to serve with distinction, protect those who needed protection, and choose humanity even when humanity was the most dangerous choice they could make. His story took significant time and effort to research and write. If you enjoyed following Harper's journey, please like this video, share it with fellow military story enthusiasts, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of courage and sacrifice.